One of the central political questions is to what degree individuals should be free to make decisions about their own lives, and to what degree should they either be required to do some things or forbidden to do others by the government. And this has been a particularly lively issue recently due to COVID, where a number of people have been forbidden to do a great many things and required to do a few things as well. I'm going to be talking about this issue from the standpoint of an economist, not a political philosopher. And so I want to start by saying what to me economics is, because I do not regard economics as the study of the economy. I don't even regard it as the way of allocating limited resources to diverse ends. To me, economics is a way of understanding behavior, and it is the way that is based on a single assumption. That assumption being that individuals have objectives and tend to take the actions that achieve them. And that is what economists mean by the assumption of rationality. It is clear that it is not a perfect description of human behavior. I have occasionally observed myself doing things that are not actually in my interest. Eating, for example, more potato chips than are good for me. It is, however, I think arguably, the part of human behavior that we can predict, and a very large part. And if you want to see a more detailed discussion of that set of issues, I've got it in a number of my books. What does economics have to do with law? From the standpoint of an economist, a legal system is a system of incentives. If I do this, what will happen to me? And then the economist says, how will rational people respond to those incentives? The question about a legal rule is not merely is it just or is it what the law says, it is if you have this rule, what will happen? How will rational people respond to it? My standard example, which any of you who have read my book Law's Order have already heard, is to imagine that we have a society where the most severe punishment is the death penalty. And somebody argues that armed robbery is a very serious crime, so we should make that a capital crime, execute armed robbers. And the response of a constitutional scholar in America will be to ask whether this is cruel and unusual punishment, which is forbidden by the U.S. punishment, the U.S. Constitution. The response of a legal philosopher maybe is this just. An economist's response is to ask whether you want armed robbers to routinely kill their victims. Because after all, if the punishment for armed robbery and the punishment for armed robbery plus murder are the same, there is no additional punishment for murder. And if you kill your victim, he can't identify you. So that is one example of the economist's way of thinking about the question, asking how will rational people respond to these rules. Economic analysis of law and other parts of economics have often used the concept that we call economic efficiency. And a full explanation would take a while, which I'm not going to give you. But roughly speaking, economic efficiency means maximizing the size of the pie, maximizing the degree to which everybody gets what he wants. So we would say that if a change benefits those who gain by more than it harms those who lose, it is an improvement in economic efficiency. And there are obviously serious conceptual problems because we're putting everybody in the world into one pie, as it were, and the same change will help some people and hurt others. But nonetheless, I think it's arguable that while it is not the only thing people care about, I would say, for example, that the destruction of your lovely cathedral would be a terrible thing even if nobody ever visited it, because it's a beautiful thing and beautiful things should exist in the world. Nonetheless, it may be the closest that we can come to a criterion of goodness that everybody can more or less agree on, and that we can use economics to figure out how to achieve. And that, I think, is the basic argument for efficiency. I should say for economists in the room that what I'm calling economic efficiency ultimately comes from an idea by Alfred Marshall, which I think is the best way of thinking about those things. But if people are curious, we can discuss that more later. He calls it economic improvement. Efficiency is a more modern term. There is a problem that all societies face, and that is the problem that economists refer to as the coordination problem. That in a moderately complicated society such as yours or mine, in order to get anything done, millions of people have to cooperate. That you don't see that because when you do something, you're already seeing the end results of their cooperation. But standard example that someone thought up a long time ago is making a pencil. It seems very simple. But in order to make a pencil, you need wood. In order to have wood, you need chainsaws. In order to have chainsaws, you need steel and oil and copper and I'm sure lots of other things. And each of those things requires things. So the problem is, and I've only got the wood so far. I haven't gotten the rubber eraser or the graphite that we call lead, each of which also requires a long chain of things. So if you think about it, even something as simple as a pencil is really being produced by millions of people. And then the problem is, how do you arrange your society in order that the right amount of all of the things needed for everything everybody is doing gets produced? You have to have enough iron ore and coal to make enough steel, to make enough chainsaws, to cut down enough trees, to make the desired number of pencils, and meanwhile you're optimizing a million other things at the same time. So your first reaction when you really think about this should be, we must all be dead. That is to say, it's hard to see how anyone could solve that problem, and if you can't solve the problem, how can you produce not just pencils, but food and medicines and all the other things that we need for a large society, and yet somehow we do. And there are basically only two solutions to the coordination, and the obvious one doesn't work. Right? The obvious one, if you start thinking about it, is have somebody in charge and have him figure out how much coal you need and how much iron you need and how much copper you need and how much everything else you need, and order everybody else to do it. And that's sort of, if you were trying to imagine it, never taking any economics, looks like the way you would solve the problem. And then if you think about it for a while, you will quickly realize that that doesn't scale. That that's an approach that might work if you're talking about 3 people running a grocery store or something, some very small project. And I've worked for a football team. I've never been a part of a football team, so I can't tell you. But that as the size of the project gets larger, it becomes harder and harder for the person at the top to know what everybody else is doing and to figure out what everybody else should be doing, and for that matter, to make everybody else do it. And the USSR was a particularly dramatic demonstration of the failure of that approach to running an economy. There is, however, a second solution, which fortunately works, which is why we're not all dead, and that's the decentralized solution. And the decentralized solution follows from a fairly small set of rules. Everything belongs to someone. Each person decides what to do with himself and his stuff. That's a property question. And people coordinate through the market. That prices signal whether more or less of something should be produced. So if the amount of copper that people want to use to make stuff is not enough, the price of copper goes up. And the people who mine copper realize we can make money by opening another mine or producing more in this mine. A full explanation of that system would require at least a semester of price theory. I've written a book called Hidden Order, which is intended as a substitute for that semester, if any of you like teaching things to yourself who haven't already done this. But the basic idea is that I pay for my inputs, and how much I have to pay for my inputs ultimately reflects the value of the people who are selling them to me, how much it costs them to produce them, or how much worse they are for not consuming them. I get paid for my outputs. Hence, I am getting, as a result of each thing I produce, the difference between the value of the people I sell it to and the cost of the people who I use, whose inputs, whether they're labor or things they produce, I use to make it. And that seems to imply that with each of us maximizing his net benefit, that we should all be maximizing our sum benefit. So what I'm describing looks like a way of getting an efficient outcome, the perfect outcome that a perfectly wise central planner would set up. And it is in a sufficiently simplified model of how the economy works, and that's a very useful model. It has a good deal of truth, but unfortunately, it works less well than that. even though it does have the great virtue that it scales, that we are in fact using that system for running a global economy at present. So what's the problem? The problem is that in some situations, my action imposes costs on other people which I don't have to compensate them for. I make steel in my steel mill. The steel mill also produces sulfur dioxide, which smells bad, and the people downwind end up breathing it. That's a cost, but it's not a cost to me, so it doesn't go into my calculation of how much steel to make or what price to charge for it or anything else. Similarly, if I'm doing something that provides a benefit, I put on a radio program. I can't control who listens to it, so I can't charge them for it, so I have an inadequate incentive to do it. So all of these things imply that what is in my interest is not always in our interest. That I may take actions, such as making the steel, even if the total costs are larger than the benefits. And I may fail to do something even where the benefits are larger than the costs. And that's what economists refer to as market failure. That market failure is best thought of as situations where individual rationality does not produce group rationality. That's at least the way I prefer to think. Now, some of these problems can be solved in various ways in a free market society. Some of them are solved by the way the legal system is set up. So, for example, consider tort law, which is an important part of modern and ancient legal systems. I can do something that benefits me but imposes costs on you. I can, for example, drive even though there is some risk that I will be careless and will scrape your car, imposing costs on you. Should I do it? The mere fact that it imposes costs doesn't imply that I shouldn't, because there are benefits as well. And from the standpoint of economic efficiency, if my benefit is greater than your cost, I should do it. If my benefit is less than your cost, I shouldn't. It's a very simple kind of rule. If, as in under tort law, at least in theory, I've got to compensate you for the damage I do, then it will only be in my interest to do it if the benefit to me is larger than the cost. And there are lots of practical problems with that. I'm skipping over large chunks of a law and econ class, but at a very basic level, that is a way in which the legal system can eliminate what would otherwise be forms of market failure. Similarly with the way property law is set up, that economists used to think of property as if it was an unambiguous idea. I either own a piece of land or I don't. And one of the things that came out of economists studying law is really realizing that ownership of land or anything else pretty much is not a simple thing, it's a bundle of rights. That I have with regard to the land I own, I have the right to forbid trespassers. I'm not sure that's true in all countries. I have a vague feeling that in Italy, I only have a right to forbid trespassers close to my house. I have a right to grow things and to keep other people from growing things and so forth. And a sensible legal system will define the rights that go with ownership of land, for example, in a way that combines those rights that go together. The ones where if I have this right, it's likely that that right is most valuable to me, but not the ones that don't. So for example, owning land includes the right to forbid trespassers. If you look at English law a few hundred years ago, my ownership of the land goes up to the heavens and down to the center of the earth. That is not a very sensible way of defining it because we have airplanes. And if you defined it that way, in order for you to fly from here to wherever you might want to fly to, the airline would have to get permission from everybody they passed over to trespass on their land. So instead, property rights in modern societies are defined in a way that doesn't. And there are lots of ambiguities about how to do it. Some of it is handled by the market, because in some cases you can say, well, the right to cross my land in order to get to your land is worth more to you than to me. That's all right, I'll sell it to you. We call that an easement. You now have a legal right to cross my land to get to your land. To some extent, you can start out with rights bundled in one way and then rebundle them by contract in order to get a more efficient way if the way you started is not best. So those are ways in which a well-designed legal system solves some of these problems. Sometimes there are market solutions to problems of market failure. So for example, consider a shopping mall. A shopping mall is a private way of coordinating the activities of a bunch of different merchants. So if you have a movie theater, you know you get more customers if there was a late night restaurant next to it for people to go to after the movie. If you have a late night restaurant, you know you'd have more customers if there was a movie theater close to it. Well, how does that get arranged? The owner of the mall rents one area to the movie theater, the area next to it to the late night restaurant. Each of them is willing to pay him a higher price because of the advantage of being next to the other one, and similarly for a whole bunch of other things. That it is easier to have one big parking lot than 10 different small parking lots for 10 different businesses. But if you have one big parking lot for your business, then all the other businesses are going to freeload, free ride, because their customers will park in it. But if you have a shopping mall, you provide one large parking lot for everybody, and you in effect charge your tenants for the fact that their customers have a place to park. So in ways like that, a bunch of what we would otherwise think of as externality problems actually get handled in the private market. Similarly, if you think about radio and television, it's clear they can't exist. Because after all, when I put on a radio broadcast, it's costly. I've got to pay people to produce it. I've got to pay my electric bill for broadcasting it, and I can't charge the people who are listening to it because I don't know who they are. Nowadays, maybe with cable or with some form of encryption, you could, but certainly as radio and television developed, you couldn't. And yet, we have radio and television. And that's because some unknown genius, I don't know what his name was, thought of this crazy idea of producing not one public good, but two. One public good that's of positive value to your customers and of positive cost to you to produce. And another one that is perhaps of slightly negative value to your customers, but you can get paid to produce, negative cost of production. You tie them tightly together and give away the package. And that, of course, is the program as the positive cost of production, and the advertisement is the negative cost of production because you get paid to do it. So that's an interesting example. We're all used to it. But if you think of it, imagining yourself in a society where it never happened, your initial instinct is, well, other than having a government subsidy for the radio, there's no way you can get it because you can't charge for it. So that was a case in which somebody's entrepreneurial ingenuity found a solution to the market failure. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that all market failure problems can be solved this way, but there are market failure problems which there isn't a good legal solution for, which there isn't a good entrepreneurial solution. And the usual conclusion that people reach from this is that since market failure results in inefficient outcomes, if you want an efficient outcome, if you want everybody to be as well off as possible, you have to have government step in order to regulate economic activity, to tell people what to do, or to tax negative externalities like my sulfur in the air, and subsidize positive externalities. And that, for economists, is the main argument for government intervention in the economy. Why is it wrong? Why it mostly doesn't work? And the answer is that we don't have available a wise and benevolent ruler. We don't have available somebody who will in fact choose to tell everybody, who will first be able to figure out the non-trivial problem, what people should do in these cases, and then have it in his own interest to make them do. So what government is the best way of thinking of government, I think, not as a wise and benevolent ruler, but rather as a market, a political market, in which just as in the private market, rational individuals are spending their resources trying to achieve their objectives. They're just doing it under a different set of rules than in the private market. And you can then use economics to try to make sense of that. The basic rule in the private market is that if I want to have your labor, or to sell you goods, or to get goods from you, I need your consent. That's really a fundamental underlying rule of the private market. On the political market, in order to do the same things, I can do any of those things without your consent if I have enough votes. I can draft you instead of hiring you. Not only for the Army, I can be drafted for jury duty, for example. We fortunately don't have a draft in the U.S. at present. And you can make people buy something, that is, tax them in order to produce it, and you can sell something. You can sell something to people. No, sorry. I guess my buy and sell are the same thing. I'll leave that out until I think about it. So, public choice theory is the approach to economics, is the approach to government, which says treat the political system as a market and apply the same analysis that we've been using for the private market to the public market, to the political market. And you can then ask the question, will the results be efficient, just like the question you asked about the private market. And that gets you to the subject of market failure on the political market. That what are the situations in which, for what reasons, rational people will not take the actions on the political market that maximize our common benefit, that are economically efficient. And if you think about it for a while, you realize that there is no shortage of examples, because most political decisions are made by people who neither pay the cost nor receive the benefit. All right? The basic logic of the decentralized model is that the reason it mostly works is that usually when I do something, I bear the costs, I get the benefit, so if the benefit's larger than cost, it pays me to do so. If not, it doesn't. But on the political market, that's practically never the case. That in order for democracy to work, voters should be well informed, but a voter who makes himself well informed is providing benefits mostly to other people in the form of electing a better politician. The legislator who passes a bill is providing costs and benefits to other people, but not to himself, except to the extent that someone's bribed him to pass it. The lobbyist benefits his customers at the cost of other people. Judges make decisions. At least in the Anglo-American system, those decisions set legal precedents. A legal precedent that made the country worse off by 1/1,000,000% would be imposing an enormous cost for one human being to impose, but the judge would never know it, let alone have it made. So that suggests that there is no reason to expect political actors to take the actions that maximize net benefits for all. Now, I don't want to overstate it. It is true that the existence of benefits to people mean that somebody will make you campaign contributions or argue with you and similar costs, but there is no mechanism analogous to the market that actually sums up the costs and benefits and then hands them to the individual decision maker. Let me go through a little more detail on that, which is pretty straightforward. Let me start with all of you, the rationally ignorant voter. That in order for democracy to work the way we theoretically think of it working, the voters have got to be well informed so that they can vote out the bad guys. But information is costly. It's, for some odd reason, no politician campaigns as I'm the bad guy. So that means that the voter has got to be able to see through all of the bad arguments made by all of the politicians and figure out for himself which one is better or at least less bad. Furthermore, he gets no return from doing that. His vote is almost never going to change the outcome of the election. If by a very unlikely chance it does, it then produces a sizable benefit, but almost all of it goes to other people. Having a better president makes several million people better off, and he's only one of them. It is rational not to buy information when it costs more than it is worth, so most voters are rationally ignorant. My experimental evidence on this a good many years ago was that I asked a college class in California, who were probably all above voting age, what was the name of their congressional representative, and about half of them knew. If voters are rationally ignorant, they support policies that sound good, or policies that their friends support and therefore will make their friends think they're good people, to someone who knows little about them and has no incentive to learn more. So you end up with a politics of sound bites and demagoguery. I can't swear that happens here, but I would be surprised if it did. Another result of market failure on the political market is that you have short time horizons, short political time horizons. Because in order for people to have an incentive to bear costs now for benefits in the future, they have to be reasonably confident that when the benefits arrive, they will be theirs. If I'm thinking of planting hardwood trees that are going to take 30 or 40 years to mature, even though I will be dead by the time they mature, it may still pay me because I can sell the field of partly grown trees in another 10 years to somebody else. But it won't pay me if during those 40 years there's a sizable chance either that a private thief will come onto the field at night with a chainsaw and walk off with my trees, or that the government will decide that they're a national resource and nationalize them. So what you need are secure property rights in order to have long-term planning. Politicians do not have security property rights. That's not always true. A king to some extent does, or a really stable dictator. But most politicians do not have secure property rights in their political assets. So a politician who does politically costly things now is providing a benefit to his successor 20 years later, who may well be of the opposite party, and by which time he himself is out of office. It therefore is rarely in the interest of politicians to bear costs, political costs now, for good results in the future, although all of them say they do. Why do they say they do? Because voters can't see the future. So if I'm doing something that makes them worse off, one way of persuading them not to vote me out is to claim that they're being made worse off now for a large benefit 20 years later, and they have no way of knowing that it's false. And perhaps the most successful application of that approach would be Joseph Stalin. Stalin could not persuade people in Moscow who were living one family to a room that things were good. But he could, for quite a while, tell them, yes, you are suffering. But you are suffering so that your children and grandchildren will be richer than the Americans. And eventually people stop believing it, but for a while, people are willing to put up with things on those grounds. But if you look at how politicians actually act, what they want to know is what is the inflation rate going to be at the next election? What is the unemployment rate going to be at the next election? Questions of that general sort. And that's perfectly rational, because another mistake you see a lot of is what I think of as lethal caution. That if you're regulating drug laws, and if you permit a drug that kills 20 people, that will be in the newspaper and you will be fired permanently. On the other hand, if you delay a drug and that kills 100 people, you are probably going to pay no cost at all, because the 100 people are not visible corpses. They are people who, they're the result of the death rate from the disease being 21% instead of 20%, because you didn't have whatever the new drug was that you were permitting, and statistical deaths are invisible, and voters are rationally ignorant. Let me take the particular case, which is currently live, of the COVID vaccine, that the statement one sees is, isn't it impressive that we got a new vaccine in less than a year? The truth, of course, is that we got that vaccine in less than a week. That is to say, the first of the ones, I think it was Moderna, but I'm not sure, the new technology vaccines, was produced by people producing it in less than a week. Now, of course, in order to distribute it, they have to ramp up production, they also have to do a good deal of testing, but there's no reason they couldn't have given it to 10,000 volunteers and just watched to see if any of them dropped dead, that is, whether there were serious side effects. And also given it to a smaller number of volunteers, preferably not old people, who agreed to be exposed to COVID so that you could find out whether the vaccine worked. And given the death rates, if they had given it to 1,000 healthy young adults, that would probably have killed nobody. It might have killed 1 or 2 people. But it would have meant getting the vaccine in a month or 2 instead of in about 10 or 11 months. The actual decision made by the FDA, and I assume regulatory agencies in Europe, was the proper way of testing something is a controlled experiment. So how do you do a controlled experiment? You get 20,000 people, you randomly vaccinate 10,000 of them, you don't tell them whether they've been vaccinated or not, you now wait 6 months or however long it takes until enough of them have just by chance caught COVID, and you say, is the number who caught it who were vaccinated substantially lower than the number who weren't, which is what they did. That's the right way to do the experiment if it's cheap, if it's free. It's the wrong way to do the experiment when the cost of it is several thousand lives a day, which is what they in fact chose to do. But they weren't the lives of regulators. So that's one example of the problem of being dangerously cautious. Another pattern, which a number of economists, this is not my invention, but it's an observation, is that the pattern of what governments do tends to be to redistribute from dispersed interest groups to concentrated interest groups. So suppose you're considering having an auto tariff, a tax on the import of automobiles, say, to the US. The tariff benefits car makers and companies and workers. The cost is borne by consumers and farmers. Why farmers, you may ask? Because the less we import, the less we will export, and the US is a major exporter of farm products. In general, the tariffs have the visible effect of making the goods that are being imported more expensive, and the invisible effect of reducing the amount of your export goods that you sell. However, the beneficiaries, the car people, consist of a handful of firms and one union, the Auto Workers Union. They've got a lot at stake. The losers are hundreds of millions of people, each losing a little. The result is that the beneficiaries can organize to offer politicians support and campaign contributions much more easily than the loser can. So the observed pattern is that it is politically profitable to benefit concentrated and well-organized groups at the cost of dispersed groups, even if the cost is much larger than the benefit. Conclusion. On the private market, individuals must usually pay for what they use and get paid for what they produce. So it is usually in their interest to make the right choices, meaning the choice that maximizes total benefit to everybody in society. But there are situations where they don't, so market failure sometimes occurs. On the political market, individuals almost never either bear the costs or receive the benefits of their actions. So they do not generally have an incentive to do those things that are worth doing and not doing those things that are not worth doing. That is, take the actions that maximize benefit to everybody. Therefore, market failure on the political market is common. And the way I like to put it is that market failure is the exception on the private market and the norm on the political market. That's a good way of summing up the basic argument. Let me take COVID as an example, since that's one we've all recently experienced. Infectious diseases are a very standard example of something that requires government intervention. And it is certainly true that you would have market failure in the sense that individuals do not have the incentive to take the optimal level of precautions. That if I do things to avoid getting COVID, one large benefit is that I don't get COVID and therefore don't die of it, or don't have a 3% chance of dying of it, which is what it was roughly before vaccination for people my age. But another benefit is that I don't pass it on to anybody else. So in my decisions of what precautions to take, of how much to isolate, of whether to wear a mask, and other things of that sort, I am getting part of the benefit of my decisions and paying all of the cost of them, and therefore will take a suboptimal level of precautions against catching COVID. And that's a perfectly legitimate, correct argument. The problem, of course, is that the people who make the decision instead, the FDA, Mr. Fauci as an advisor to the president, and various other authorities, bear none of my costs. That if I get sick and die, Mr. Fauci doesn't die as a result. So they neither bear the cost of my getting it, nor of the precautions, which means, on the one hand, that they don't have an optimal incentive to keep me safe, so to speak. That's one thing they care about, that it's politically unpopular to have lots of people be sick, but it's not clear by how much. And they may choose to, in the extreme case of China, lock people up in Shanghai, and maybe a few of them starve to death, and probably more than a few die of heart attacks because they can't get to the hospital when they're locked up, and so forth. But the people who die are not the Xi Jinping, are not the authorities who are making those rules. So therefore, we would expect that the authorities, whether the Premier of China or President of the US or the FDA or any of these other people they might order too many precautions, they might order too few precautions, and they might order the wrong precautions. One of the things that struck me with COVID is that at the very beginning of COVID, there was a speculation that it was transmitted over surfaces. So in fact, in the roughly the first year, until we got vaccinated, my family was being very careful because I and my wife were old enough to be vulnerable. So when we had food delivered, if it was not perishable food, we let it sit on the porch for 3 days, that being the estimate of how long it took. As far as I can tell, there was never any good evidence for transmission that way. It turned out that the major form of transmission was through the air. Nonetheless, you will still see airports insisting that you should wash your hands all the time, doing various things which are designed to respond to what was believed to be the problem a year and a half ago. Because after all, once you've told them you do it, you don't really want to have to admit that you were wrong and tell them they don't have to do it anymore. In addition, COVID is a rather extreme case because there's a sizable chance that COVID only existed because of government action. We don't know for sure where it came from. However, we do know that it first appeared very close to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that it is a virus descended from bat viruses, and that oddly enough, the WIV was doing research on bat viruses. So it is possible that it's just a coincidence. It's possible that it's a bat virus, maybe a mutated bat virus that they brought to study and that somehow got out. It is possible that they were actually doing gain-of-function experiments, being, of course, subsidized by both the US and the Chinese government for doing it. But that's a particular case where it at least seems a substantial chance that the whole problem was the result of government action. We don't know what it was. I don't want to overstate the case. So if you think about the choice between the private and the political market, between individual liberty and government decisions, liberty is almost always better from the standpoint of economic efficiency, aside from any moral views you may have about the desirability of freedom. That suggests your first reaction to that might be, well, there will be only those few things where the government does it better because of extreme forms of market failure, and you should have the government do those things and nothing else. But the problem is, how do you decide which things those are? Well, that decision is being made by the governments. And the government will naturally enough have an incentive to think up reasons why auto tariffs are really in the national interest and they're really correcting some subtle form of market failure. The government and supporters of governments have been trying to do that for, what, a century and a half maybe, since Ricardo correctly worked out the economics of foreign trade, so that you would think that the government will try to claim that anything that's politically profitable qualifies. And that suggests that the best solution is not to have a government. This is where I'm becoming even more radical than I suspect most of the audience. That the loss from governments not that there aren't things that governments can do that make the world better, because there are, but that the loss from governments doing things it shouldn't is likely to be greater than the gain from having government do those things that it shouldn't. And my first book, Machinery of Freedom, that I believe somebody mentioned, because I could understand it even in a language I didn't speak, was partly one of the 3 sections of that book was exploring what a society might look like in which you had private property and trade but had no government, had private institutions and substitution. On the other hand, there is a possible exception to that conclusion. And the exception to that inclusion is a situation where the market failure on the private market is not only bad but catastrophic. That if it is bad enough that not having the government do something is worse than all the damage that will be done if you have a government, there is then an economic argument for having a government while doing your best to limit its expansion. And of course, the obvious example of that would be national defense. That it does no good to keep your country free from your government if the result is that it gets conquered by somebody else's government. Now, I don't want to overstate it. I discussed ways in which on the market, various forms of market failure can be dealt with privately. And there are, in fact, ways in which the form of market failure that keeps you from defending your country can be dealt with. I spent 2 chapters, one in the first edition of Machinery of Freedom and another one in the 3rd edition, describing ways in which you might be able to defend a stateless society against an adjacent enemy, an adjacent state. However, just as in what I was saying with regard to the market in general, there is no guarantee you will be able to solve all forms of market failure. And in particular, if the enemy that you're worried about is sufficiently powerful and aggressive, it may well be that the private solutions cannot provide enough defense to keep it from conquering you. So the conclusion is that there may be some societies where a government is indeed the least bad alternative. That is a much more plausible possibility for the Ukraine or for Slovakia than it is for the US, because Russia is a rather more dangerous neighbor than either Canada or Mexico. If you want much more of my ideas, here is my webpage, which contains the full text of a fair number of my books, links to it, the full text of probably most of my published articles, and a variety of other things. My blog is not very active at the moment, though I do put things on it occasionally, but I've got a lot of stuff over the last 15 years or so, which you might find interesting on many things. I think that finishes what I had for my talk. You now get to ask questions, and the great thing about answering a question is that you can be fairly confident that at least one person in the room is interested in what you're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture.